Ralf Schumacher just dropped a bombshell. Aston Martin is preparing to sign Oscar Piastri. He led Norris for most of the season, faster in quali, smarter in races, and yet, McLaren's strategy turned against him. Now he's just 1 point behind Norris with 4 races left and quietly in talks with F1's next superpower. This isn't just a transfer rumor. It's the beginning of a seismic shift in Formula One's future. Before I tell you all the information, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and we'll continue with the news. Oscar Piastri was never meant to be the number 2. When he joined McLaren, it wasn't as a quiet junior, but as a generational talent, a Formula 2 champion with a resume that left no room for doubt. And for most of the 2025 season, he proved it. Faster than Lando Norris in qualifying. Sharper in race trim. More controlled under pressure. There were moments where he looked like the future of the sport, perhaps even its next great tactician behind the wheel. But now, with 4 races left, the numbers tell a different story. 1 point behind Norris. The hunted, not the hunter. And that's where the unease begins. Because the drop in points doesn't reflect a drop in talent. It reflects something deeper, an imbalance inside McLaren. Races where Piastri was asked to hold position despite being quicker. Races where strategy calls mysteriously favored the other side of the garage. And all of this without a single public complaint from the Australian. No press conference drama. No passive-aggressive radio. Just results eroding, week by week, in silence. Behind closed doors, however, the noise is growing. Ralf Schumacher, never one to speak lightly, now claims that Piastri is being courted by Aston Martin. A team poised for transformation. They've got Adrian Newey coming in, a works Honda engine arriving, and a seat likely to open once Fernando Alonso hangs up his helmet. And if there's one thing they lack, it's a young, technical, front-running driver who can lead them into the next cycle. Piastri fits the brief almost too well. Which raises the real question, why would McLaren even risk losing him? For most of 2025, Oscar outdrove expectations. He didn't just match Norris, he often beat him. On circuits as different as Suzuka and Barcelona, he found time where others saw limitation. And yet, when strategy calls came, he was the one who stepped aside. It's not about blame. It's about perception. And right now, the paddock sees a power shift that doesn't favor the driver doing more with less. The rumor about Aston Martin isn't random. It's a warning shot. That if McLaren continues to undervalue Piastri's contributions, if they keep forcing compromises in favor of brand loyalty or team politics, they may lose a driver who could define the next decade. And not because he failed, but because they failed to protect him. Oscar Piastri's season began with promise and authority. For the first 15 rounds, he wasn't just fast, he was leading. Leading in qualifying head-to-heads. Leading in composure. And often, leading Lando Norris in the points. It was clear McLaren had not one, but 2 elite-level drivers. But something shifted. Quietly, gradually. Race after race, strategy calls began leaning toward Norris. Pit windows favored the other garage. Team radio instructions became more cautious, more compromising when it came to Oscar's track position. And for a driver that had earned his status through performance, the sudden change in treatment raised questions. The inflection point came in Monza. Piastri was ahead, controlling his pace, only to be told to yield position. No undercut. No strategy gain. Just a switch. Publicly framed as team benefit. Privately, it was the moment many insiders pointed to as the first sign of McLaren protecting Norris's campaign. Singapore added fuel to the fire. Norris nearly collided with Piastri in a late-braking lunge, forcing Oscar offline. The team called it racing. But again, Oscar was the one who absorbed the cost both in points and perception. This pattern wasn't about talent. Piastri has never lacked that. It was about how teams manage 2 stars and which one they quietly designate the favorite. McLaren may not have said it aloud, but actions spoke clearly. Strategy bias, track position, and even engineering priorities began falling in Norris's favor. And while Oscar continued to deliver results, he did so under increasingly tighter margins. Every overtake had to be clean. Every radio message restrained. Because when you're second in politics, even when you're first in performance, the margin for error disappears. And yet, Piastri said nothing. That's the part that's earned him respect across the paddock. No tantrums. No passive-aggressive digs. Just quiet defiance on track. But silence doesn't mean absence of tension. According to internal reports, Piastri's side of the garage has grown increasingly frustrated not with the car, but with how their feedback and race preferences are prioritized. In a sport where milliseconds matter, those decisions add up. And right now, they're costing Oscar more than time. They're costing trust. The latest standings show him just 1 point behind Norris. But that number doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't reveal the team orders, the strategy switches, or the points left on the table due to factors outside his control. Oscar isn't losing on track. He's losing in the margins. And in elite motorsport, that's where titles and careers are decided. When a driver begins to feel that the game is being tilted, even slightly, the seed of doubt is planted. Not in himself, but in the project. And that's the real problem. McLaren risks turning its most promising driver into a flight risk. Because in Formula One, confidence must be mutual. Piastri has shown loyalty. He's delivered pace, results, and professionalism. But when that effort is met with strategic imbalance, the equation breaks. And that's when a rumor like Aston Martin's interest stops sounding like speculation and starts sounding like a logical escape. Oscar Piastri has always been a data-first driver. Methodical. Quiet. Surgical in how he builds speed across a weekend. At the start of 2025, that approach gave McLaren a unique edge. While Norris pushed the car aggressively, Piastri was refining it, identifying right height imbalances, correcting mid-corner instability, and extracting lap time without overstressing the tires. His style wasn't spectacular, but it was efficient. And on a car as sensitive to setup direction as the MCL38, that subtlety mattered. McLaren's early season form owed as much to Oscar's feedback as it did to raw pace. That technical harmony began to crack when the team introduced their mid-season aero package. The upgrades targeted at front-wing load and underfloor air distribution were designed around Norris's preferred characteristics: sharper front-end rotation, quicker steering response. On paper, they offered equal benefit. In practice, they unsettled the balance Oscar had spent months perfecting. His driving didn't regress, he simply had to reprogram it. A driver like Norris could live with an edgy front. Piastri preferred predictability. And the car was no longer predictable. The difference showed most clearly in qualifying. Earlier in the year, Piastri had the edge on Saturdays, outqualifying Norris 8 times in the opening stretch. But post-upgrade, that margin began to fade. Not because Oscar lost speed, but because the window where the car behaved how he needed it to had narrowed. In Q1 and Q2, he was still clinical. But in Q3, with low fuel, maximum power, and track evolution at its peak, the balance often shifted out of reach. And in Formula One, a tenth lost in confidence is 2 tenths lost on the stopwatch. The race pace told a subtler story. In clean air, Piastri remained one of the most consistent drivers on the grid. His tire management was elite, especially in high-deg circuits like Qatar and Coda. But race strategy rarely gave him that clean air. Time and again, he was boxed into traffic. Called in a lap late. Asked to undercut with colder tires. Meanwhile, Norris was given the undercut, the free air, the aggressive call. Over time, that's not just a strategic imbalance, it becomes a psychological weight. Every lap feels like damage control, rather than opportunity. And yet, Oscar never cracked. He adapted. Began modifying his entry lines to account for front-end instability. Worked with his engineers to isolate corner-specific rake issues. Even changed his throttle mapping mid-stint to control the rear axle under acceleration. He wasn't driving around the problem, he was driving through it. That kind of technical resilience is rare. Especially for someone in only his second full season of Formula One. This is why Aston Martin is watching. Not just because of the points, but because Piastri has demonstrated something more valuable: adaptability under imbalance. He's taken a car drifting away from his strengths, reshaped his approach, and still delivered results. When engineers see that, they don't see a driver surviving, they see a leader. A future team anchor. And in a paddock planning for 2026 and beyond, those traits are now worth more than pole positions. The numbers are deceiving. 1 point between Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris sounds like a close fight, an internal duel decided over details. But the truth behind that statistic tells a more complicated story. Oscar led for most of the season, through merit and mechanical control. Yet now, after months of strategic misalignment and on-track sacrifice, he finds himself behind. Not because he lost performance, but because the system around him slowly pulled its support away. That single point isn't just a gap. It's a signal. A warning that trust inside McLaren may no longer be evenly split. In high-performance environments, confidence isn't abstract, it's measurable. It's pit priority, tire choice, data flow, and most crucially, timing. When a driver feels backed, he attacks with freedom. When he doesn't, every lap becomes cautious. Oscar Piastri, despite the trend, has kept his head down. No outbursts. No coded messages. But beneath the surface, the psychological cost is real. He's had to drive not just with intensity but with restraint. Playing the team game. Letting others through. Holding station when instinct screamed otherwise. That kind of restraint becomes heavy. It erodes clarity. Piastri now races knowing that pace alone may not decide the outcome. That team orders can override qualifying. That pit stops can be shaped by brand politics, not racing logic. And when a driver senses that, he begins to think differently. Less about sector deltas. More about long-term moves. More about future garages. Because a driver's best years are finite. And being second on the call sheet when your data says you're first is the fastest way to lose faith. And this is what Aston Martin is counting on. They see a competitor who's still delivering under pressure. Who's absorbed the politics, the preference, the subtle sidelining and kept pushing. That makes him dangerous. Not just as a driver, but as a decision maker. Because when the time comes to sign a deal or trigger an exit clause, Oscar won't act emotionally. He'll act surgically. Quietly. The same way he races. And McLaren may not see it coming until the signature is dry. Internally, the cost is starting to show. Engineers have begun shifting focus. Not in allegiance, but in output. Conversations lean toward Norris's race strategy. Data briefs favor his preferred setups. Piastri's side of the garage still works at full tilt, but the energy has changed. In elite motorsport, you can feel when momentum leaves a corner. And right now, Piastri's momentum is being held back not by rivals, but by decisions above the cockpit.